Welcome back to The Pulse, your weekly guide to global health. Diseases have a way of reminding us just how globalized our world has become. Bird flu is a perfect example. From its start in Southeast Asia and China, the disease has spread to the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. While millions of birds have caught the virus, so far only 300 people have been infected. That's because the virus still has trouble spreading from birds to humans, for now. If it could make this jump more easily, the results would be catastrophic. The Pulse went to visit those in the front line of developing a vaccine against this emerging threat.
From the streets and markets of Indonesia comes a warning, the first signs of a pandemic of flu that could kill millions. More people have been killed here by bird flu than in any other country. More than 100 have been infected, more than 80 have died.
Basically, until now, the case fatality rate is more than 70%. It's about 70 to 75%. So out of 4, 3 died. So I think that's a very, very serious for us.
Indonesia is so worried about bird flu, it's declared it a national emergency. A dedicated bird flu isolation ward has been set up in Jakarta's Friendship Hospital. But despite the doctors' best efforts, most of their patients die. They're being killed by a very dangerous strain of bird flu known as H5N1. It kills both birds and people with shocking speed.
The birds can be exposed to H5N1 and then maybe 2 days later they will be dead. It happens so quickly. And really this high pathogenicity has transposed into human infections as well, because a normal flu virus in man, it will replicate in the upper and lower respiratory tract and just stay there. But with the highly pathogenic viruses, the viruses are able to escape from their normal site of replication into many different parts of the body. And really they take over the body. And the people who have died from H5N1 infection, they've died of multiple organ failure.
Viruses are hard to beat once the body has been invaded. The few drugs developed to attack the flu virus are not very effective. Only if they're taken early can they stop the virus spreading inside the body. Once it has spread, it's not clear that these drugs can save lives. So what can be done? Doctors are putting their faith in trying to prevent people getting this avian flu, as they do with any other flu, by giving them a vaccination. The first step in making any flu vaccine is to manipulate the genes of the virus. The key, like any other flu vaccine, is that the surface proteins have to be preserved. These stimulate and strengthen the patient's immune system. To help this process, they're mixed with genes from a harmless virus, which can be grown in a highly nutritious but self-contained biological environment. An egg.
This is the first stage of our production process, which is the inoculation, the insertion of the seed, the viral seed, received from the authorities.
The eggs are inoculated with a modified viral seed.
It's been modified in such a way that it retains the characteristics of the wild strain in terms of the antigenic response it develops in the people who receive it, but it doesn't cause a disease. This is the purification suite. This is where we take the bulk material that is extracted from the eggs. We separate the viral particles from the protein and then purify that material, which is then formulated into the injection later.
The trouble is, this is a complex process and it can't be speeded up, even if a pandemic were to break out and spread rapidly around the world.
Influenza vaccine production is a biological process. The virus has to grow, it has to grow in huge amounts. For each vaccine dose, 1 egg is necessary. The egg has to be, of course, has to be produced, and the vaccine has to be put into the egg. That has to be harvested, has to be cleaned, quality controlled, has to be filled in syringes, and all this takes time.
And because the flu virus keeps evolving, the whole process has to be repeated from scratch each year. The World Health Organization and its partners constantly monitor new emerging strains of the virus to work out which are the most dangerous.
There are 118 national influenza centres scattered around the world, and they are all monitoring newly emerging influenza viruses.
From identifying the correct virus strain to delivering the vaccine to doctors takes about 6 to 8 months, and it costs a lot of money. Building new production lines like this one in the UK to meet the demand isn't cheap either.
Increasing production capacity, for instance, would mean that for every 20 million doses more produced, companies have to invest $100 million.
And despite the expense, these seasonal vaccines are unlikely to protect people against an outbreak of pandemic flu.
They're related, but not exactly the same. So there is a school of thought that says that this relatedness may give some protection. It really is, I think, a long shot. You cannot expect a seasonal vaccine to give you protection against a highly pathogenic H5N1.
We know that the peak of the pandemic will be reached within 85 days, so very fast. And people predict that 100 to 200 million people will die.
The pandemic may be here before the vaccine is ready, and that's a big problem.
So the best tool we have against pandemic flu may only be available after it has killed most of its victims. Right now, the H5N1 virus mostly affects birds. Only rarely does it infect humans. But this is starting to change.
They're adapted to attaching to avian cells, to getting into those cells and replicating and infecting another bird. They're not well adapted to infecting people, thank goodness. There is a certain barrier, and to overcome that barrier would just be 1 or 2 mutations away. And in fact, some of those changes are actually happening. The H5N1 viruses have been detected from human infections where those surface changes have taken place.
This mutation rate could speed up dramatically. When humans and birds come into contact, so do their different types of flu. If someone infected with human flu also catches H5N1 from a bird, the 2 sets of genes might mix together. The result could be a virus as lethal as H5N1 that can spread between humans. It could be as deadly as the 1918 pandemic.
That was the most devastating pandemic in living memory. The death rate was about 2.5%. That, with a global spread, meant that about 40 million people died as a result of this worldwide pandemic. If we think what's happening in Southeast Asia and in Europe, with a mortality rate of 60% for H5N1, it really brings it home to you how devastating an H5N1 pandemic could be.
Vaccination could make a massive difference.
If your immune system has been exposed through a vaccine, you will reduce the severity of the disease. It doesn't mean that you will block totally the infection, but at least you will decrease dramatically the severity of the disease and for sure the mortality.
But a pandemic vaccine can only be made after the pandemic breaks out. It will take about 6 months to manufacture it in quantity. It could be too little, too late.
It's currently estimated that it will take 1 year after the emergence of the pandemic virus until around about 1.1 billion doses are going to be available. So there will be vaccine available. There has been great progress, but there may not be enough, and therefore we need to look at innovative options now.
So the flu vaccine manufacturers are now developing these pre-pandemic vaccines based on existing strains of H5N1.
You can use a stockpile vaccine in 2 ways. You can actually keep it somewhere ready for the pandemic emergency and then bring it out and immunize people. Or you could prime people in advance. You could give a vaccine before a pandemic just to prime their immune system. Both have their attractions.
And both have their risks.
Because you don't know that the strain in the vaccine is going to be a good match with the pandemic strain. But I think that's a risk worth taking.
Some governments, such as Switzerland, Japan and the US, are already buying pre-pandemic vaccines. So the manufacturers are working out how to produce them in vast quantities.
We started around 3 years ago manufacturing for clinical trials on a small scale. Over the last 2 years, both in the US and in France, we've been manufacturing at full scale. We realized that we had to move from the clinical level to full-scale manufacture to really learn about how to manufacture this product.
Each manufacturer is trying to increase the effectiveness of their own version of the pre-pandemic vaccine at smaller and smaller doses. This will boost the total number of people they can reach.
Many companies are developing one or two of these types of vaccines. You can imagine that the investment is considerable. There are more than 12 companies which are currently investing. There are more than 40 clinical trials going on. Some of the vaccines have already been approved, others are in the development, so the investment is considerable.
The companies argue that preparing for a global pandemic, a once-in-a-lifetime event, will be so expensive that only governments will be able to afford it.
The governments which are putting cash on the table are, for instance, the United States, where more than $1 billion has gone into 5 companies to support production capacities and also clinical trials. There is some investment within Europe, not as much as we have seen from North America.
A pandemic is not a certainty. What is certain is that good planning and the right tools could save millions of lives. And with all we now know, those tools are much closer to hand.
There's been a huge amount of progress. We hear a lot of negative information about H5N1 and the huge threat, but there's been an awful lot happening. The whole concept of preparing against pandemic influenza has really evolved enormously over the past few years.
Vaccination cannot prevent a flu pandemic, but it seems to be our best hope. The question is, will enough people get the vaccine early enough to save lives?
That's all for this edition. Join us again next time on The Pulse.